Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for this opportunity to speak. So, as you all just heard, I'm coming from the medical field, and my degree is in computer science, Ph.D. in computer science, but really my background and my interest lies in medical imaging, medical image processing, and its applications. And I had the wonderful opportunity of actually being a professor in a radiology department for a number of years, almost 9 years, and now I am working at Kitware. So today, what I'm going to be talking about is open source and the role it's played in my career, as well as the evolving role within the medical field and beyond. And what I want you all to come away with today is a sense for a desire, actually, to participate in the open source community. All right, I want you guys to come away with the realization of the benefit that comes from using open source and contributing back to open source. All right, because it's been a huge benefit to my career. And so throughout, I'm going to flavor the talk with a lot of medical imaging analogies and descriptions, case studies of open source, but really it is more broad than that. And so within the field of medical imaging, open source is really just permeating the field, and it's in all aspects of medical imaging and medical data analysis in general. And so from the micro to macro level, from microscopy all the way up to CT, MRI, gross anatomy scale, open source is at play, all right? It's being used in the field of cardiology, surgery, radiation oncology, radiology, so forth and so on. Beyond just imaging, though, it's also being used in aspects of informatics, so genomics, proteomics, all the different studies in big data analysis that's becoming popular now. Additionally, it's being used in much more high-performance computing situations now as well. In the pharma industry, there's a trend to, prior to doing preclinical studies, so animal studies or even human studies, you run simulations in order to predict the effect a drug is going to have on the organs throughout the body. And these simulation environments that the pharmaceutical industry is making use of are largely based on open source software. Additionally, we have information technology, electronic health record systems based on open source, manufacturing, the list goes on and on and on. So what I'm going to do is go a little bit more in depth than just 3 examples of open source in medical imaging. All right. First one is Image Guided Surgical Toolkit, IGSTK. All right. There's acronyms throughout the talk. All right. Acronyms are job security. It's what the medical field does. Anyway, IGSTK. What this is an open source toolkit that helps register preoperative images. So MRI and CT that were taken before an operation in which you've designated the surgical plan that you want to conduct. So the boundaries of the tumor that you want to remove, the position you want a needle to be in order to ablate and burn away a tumor, that sort of thing. You want to take that preoperative plan and you want to move it into the intraoperative environment, all right? So that that intraoperative plan, instead of appearing on just the preoperative image, it gets overlaid on top of the intraoperative image, that intraoperative MR, the intraoperative ultrasound via registration. Or else it gets the surgical instruments that you're manipulating are tracked via optical or magnetic trackers, and they're positioned on top of that preoperative image so that you can see that, sure enough, my needle is in the right place. It corresponds, or it's in registration with the point that I designate on my preoperative image. And the way it does this, the way the IGSTK works, is it interfaces with a variety of optical and magnetic tracking technologies, commercial systems that are out there. Additionally, so it can track instruments and the movement of patients, plus it has image registration algorithms within it. Now, it was developed at Georgetown University and in collaboration with a bunch of other universities and institutes. And the neat part about this is it's really a different kind of image processing library, or a different kind of software library, because in the surgical guidance field, it's just absolutely critical that you have a stable system. All right, so instead of using a traditional programming paradigm for this IGSTK, the way you interact with it is through a state transition diagram. All right, it has a state machine in which you specify your states and your transitions that you want to have. And then you can have all these theoretic approaches in order to analyze that state diagram that describes your application to make certain the corner cases are handled, so that if someone trips over the power cord and unplugs your tracker in the middle of an operation, the system fails gracefully. It has a way of dealing with that. And you know that your software is set up in a way to be rigorous enough to deal with those kinds of situations. And so here is an academically produced software system that is just amazingly rigorous, well documented, and really uses cutting edge software design principles in order to carry out its goal. Now, the neat thing about this is that it has also been adapted, being open source. It's been adapted to, by a group in Milan, Italy, to interface with surgical robots. And so because it was open source, Kevin isn't doing any robotics himself. But other people then took this toolkit and adapted it so that you can control a robot using the same software environment. And that robot will then guide a needle to a target location. It'll do deep brain stimulation, guide biopsies, different things along those lines. And so this toolkit has expanded beyond what the creator originally devised. And as open source software, I have a strong bias. This is true open source software in that it is released under a BSD style license. So it can be used for both commercial as well as non-commercial purposes. So you can have this operating, you can take this and embed it within a product. And sure enough, this group in Argentina has taken IGSTK, wrapped it in a better user interface, went through their equivalent of an FDA approval process, and now there's a commercial system running in Argentina, used to perform surgeries, and actually it's been exported beyond that throughout South America, and it was developed by this guy at Georgetown University. So it's one toolkit that's just had this amazing progression from what its designer originally intended. And then there's another toolkit. This is the VISTA system, or actually it's an application. So the acronym for VISTA is given there on the left side. What this is an electronic health record system. So it's a big database, all right? And it's used for storing patient records. You know, what tests should be performed on a patient, what tests have been performed on a patient, and what are the results of all of those tests? You know, MR, CT, pathology reports, and so forth. And so this is the system that was developed by the VA, by the Veterans Association, all right? And it ends up that the VA is the largest medical system in the USA. We're looking at 8 million veterans being served by this system. It's 180,000 medical personnel are involved in the VA and the VHA. And 25% of your physicians out there, 25% of the people with an MD degree at some time has done training in a VA system, in the VA hospital. They've all seen and been involved in using this EHR. This electronic health record system is freely open source now. Rumor has it that like Lebanon, country of Lebanon, is using this as their EHR system, all right? So it's pretty amazing the effect that these have done, that these have had, and how open source is really just prevalent in ways that you wouldn't imagine. It's interesting, the history behind this toolkit, the system, it was actually initially released under the Freedom of Information Act. And so people petitioned for its release, they got the source code that way, and now actually huge industries have come up in support of our communities, come up in support of this open source software that we now have. Final example that I've got is 3D Slicer, all right? And this was developed initially at Brigham and Women's Hospital as 2 grad students' master's thesis. All right. And where it's grown is just well beyond that. We're now looking at, in the past year, 80,000 downloads for this toolkit, which is geared towards medical imaging research. So it contains 40 or more libraries that are out there that allow you to segment medical images, register medical images, look at diffusion tractography, look at surgical guidance techniques. This incorporates the image-guided surgical toolkit. Just on and on, the large number of applications are possible with this. Now, the neat thing about this toolkit, what makes it special is it's for research and it's completely open source and freely available, very widely adopted. And if you want the latest diffusion tensor imaging, DTI technique, that's out there that you read in a journal article that maybe came out of University of Iowa, you can actually go to Slicer and it'll contain that image. So here's an open source software which really represents the state of the art. This is an open source software in which it's very easy to write encapsulated modules that then run as shared libraries within the Slicer environment and extend its capabilities. And it really represents an environment that's better than any commercial system that currently exists for reviewing medical images. It really is quite powerful. And so we've seen that in all aspects of medicine, we now have open source being involved. And as I mentioned originally, it's extended well beyond the medical field, in that if you look, this is appeared within USA Today originally. If you look at the graph, back in 2006, we had about 100,000 estimated number of open source applications. 2012, we have over a million open source applications. And by 2014, that's expected to double. We see these open source applications appearing in your phone, Android operating systems, in your car, Android operating systems. It's being promoted by DoD, NASA, so forth and so on, and White House as a huge open source initiative. And it's been estimated that 80% of the commercial companies that are out there that make software and release the software, they're using open source software in their applications that they're releasing. So what I'm going to do, the outline that I've got given today, so that just kind of sets a context of the breadth at which we're talking about when we talk about open source software. I'm going to talk about first how I moved from academia to industry and how that really led a bunch of people to ask me, are you crazy? All right? And so give a little bit of detail there. Why would I give up in academia to move to industry? Then secondly, I want to show how academia and industry are actually growing together, and this is due to open source software. All right? That bridge that used to exist, that craziness that existed between the two environments, that gap is narrowing all the time due to open source. And then I'll talk about trends and challenges in open source software. So, am I crazy? It was a GE researcher, a very prominent GE researcher, Jim Miller, who asked me that question in 2005. So, as you all know, or as was mentioned earlier, I was at UNC in the radiology department. I had tenure, I had grants, I had patents. I actually had a large lab of 13 faculty and staff under me, and then a large number of students on top of that. ITK, the Insight Toolkit that I'll talk about later on, had just been released, a very successful open source toolkit that my team was one of the participants in. I had been elected president of the nonprofit that was running ITK. I was given invited talks. I was doing the whole academic route, and I was in academia, so I was essentially fighting for good, all right? I was part of the good people, all right? Well, in 2005, December 2005, what prompted Jim Miller to ask me this question is that I left UNC and joined industry, all right? I went from that good academic environment to the evil empire, to evil industry. And so, and Kitware in particular seemed like an odd choice to Jim Miller. Why would you join this company? Because Kitware at the time was trying to sell commercial products, all right? And it was famous for being a failure for its ability to sell commercial products, all right? It was just doing a horrible job selling ActiViz and a bunch of other things you've never heard of, all right? And instead, it had its 25, and it had only 25 people, so, you know, its survival for another year or two was in question. And also, I was leaving academia where I was clearly a researcher and joining industry, which in a bunch of people's eyes meant going from being a researcher to being a programmer, just a programmer, all right? So what I found out though, or the reality of it is, you know, why Kitware? Well, even though they were bad at selling products, what I had noted and what I had experienced and what I want to share with you guys over the next few minutes is that they were extremely good at open source software, all right? They were in the middle of all of these different toolkits that are listed here. So CMake is a product of theirs, ParaView, VTK, Insight Toolkit, on and on and on. They were responsible for the development and then leading the organization of most of these toolkits that you've seen. And so even though they were horrible at products, they were great at open source. And additionally, on the side, while they were waiting for their products to take off, they were using this open source in order to do consulting, in order to help businesses solve hard problems. And really, that's what got me interested. All right, here I was in academia solving hard problems. Here was a company that I thought really could do a great job of solving hard problems with open source. So what I want to convince you all is that, you know, what made open source, what I'm going to focus on now is what made open source special to me back then. You know, why was there such this draw that I would leave tenure in order to go to this open source environment? So to understand that takes a little bit of understanding the history of open source and then what it means to contribute to open source. So, by the way, what I want you to keep in mind, a little bit of a spoiler alert, the reason why open source is so important, in my opinion, is the impact that it can have. And so that's going to be a recurring theme throughout the remainder of the presentation. So, history of open source. Ends up that computer science and software really began as a predominantly open source environment, all right? If you look back to the 1970s, and actually I've been programming since about 1976, what you would do is you would get Byte Magazine or Creative Computing or Dr. Jobs Journal. I mean, I see one or two people with a bit of gray smiling. All right, they know what I'm talking about. These journals, they would actually print the code for programs in the pages of the journal. And then as a young kid, or maybe not so young kid, you would go ahead and type in the code from within these journals that they had. And so really, it was open source software. That's how you learned how to program. That's how you got a new program on your computer that you had in your house, all right? And so it was a wonderful time, all right? AT&T, so forth and so on. However, in the 1980s is when the PC became dominant, all right, was introduced and became dominant. And all of a sudden, this industry grew up around making and selling software. And so it became a predominantly closed source environment for software. It was a very rapid and strong change that occurred. And so in 1983, Richard Stallman came up with the GNU project, our new project. And that promoted open source. He wanted to get back to the good old days. And he wanted open source to be the dominant way in which software was produced, and actually the only way. He's very zealot, very much a zealot when it comes to open source software. He wanted everything to be open source. And so he came up with this license called the GPL or GPL license, in which if you had some software and you released it under the GPL license, anyone who made use of your software in certain ways, it automatically forced them, or they were obligated to turn around and release their software open source as well. It's called copyleft, all right? Instead of copyright, copyleft. And in 1983, and that was amazingly popular through the 1980s, 1990s, and into 2000. But forward ahead now from 1983, 30 years later, 2013, and open source, as I was saying, permeates the medical imaging field and really just academia and industry in general. All right, it is the primary way. Few of us in the audience have probably not done some sort of open source software, made use of it. But the license has changed from this GPL license, this license that had this copyleft effect, to a BSD style license. That invites both academic and industry participation in the open source. We have platforms such as Android and Linux that are now very popular and open source in and of themselves. We have tools like MySQL for data management. We have CMake, ITK, Slicer, all of this, all levels of software development involving open source now. So another way of looking at this history is, before the question was, or the concern with open source was, you got what you paid for. All right, so in the 1990s, 1980s, there was this notion that, well, if it was given away for free and it didn't work, you know, that's not a surprise. There was no expectation of open source software being good. But if you look at it now, open source software, as I've illustrated, it's being used in surgical guidance systems. It's being used for medical imaging research to carry the state-of-the-art methods. It really is a high-quality platform. All right, it no longer has that notion of you get what you pay for. Additionally, copyleft, which used to really scare the industry, all right, because of its viral effects. It is no longer the dominant license that's out there, but instead this BSD-style license is the dominant license. For industry, this means no recurring fee. For the people who release the open source, if it's coming out of academia or wherever, the nice part about industry involvement is that industry is very rigorous at finding and fixing bugs. So if they use your open source software and they find bugs and report them back to you, they're going to find bugs that you never imagined, all right? And they're going to do it with a level of rigor in order to make sure your software is as stable as possible. And we saw that on the ITK, and I'll give some examples of this in the future, but industry really has a lot of benefit when they participate in your projects. Additionally, open source represents the state of the art. We saw that within the Slicer with the best algorithms that are out there. Actually, those algorithms are implemented by the people who invented them, and then they're released. So it really is the best of the best that now open source provides. And so what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit more about, there we go. What I'm going to do is talk a little bit more about CMake as far as high quality software and what that means within the open source field, as well as the Insight Toolkit. So CMake, how many of you all have heard of this? I just want to know. I know it's software development. All right, that's great. By the way, how many of you all knew that Kitware made CMake? 1, 2. All right, that's better than most. Most people have no clue. Anyway, CMake is a tool for cross-platform development of software. All right, and what this means is that you write one configuration file, and using that configuration file, CMake is able to then make it so that your software will build under a Windows platform, a Linux platform, Macintosh platform, on and on, a variety of different platforms. So you as a Microsoft programmer or as a Linux programmer, you might only know Linux and Microsoft. And so you write the configuration file and you do all your development in just Linux or just in Microsoft. Let's say it's Microsoft. Well, wouldn't it be great, or via CMake, you have this wonderful thing where if you then release that open source, if you release that software to other people, if someone's running a Macintosh and you've used CMake, they're actually going to be able to compile and use your software. All right? So CMake allows the number of users of your software to just grow that much more. So no longer your software is locked into just one platform, but your software has great breadth associated with it. Now, it's interesting that the funding for this actually came from the National Library of Medicine as part of the ITK Toolkit development that I'm going to talk about later on. But there they wanted to make sure the software that they wrote would have the largest possible impact, and so CMake came out of that. And sure enough, it's downloaded now over 3,000 times a day. This is really just a dominant tool within the field. It's used to create NVIDIA drivers. It's used to create Second Life is compiled using it. KDE, arguably one of the largest open source projects out there, uses it. It really is just dominating the field. And the neat part about CMake is that not only does it help your software compile on all these different platforms, but it also, in combination with CTest and CDash, it allows your software to automatically be tested on all of those different platforms. So not only will it compile your software, but you have the option of then running a bunch of tests on that compiled software automatically right after the compilation completes, and then reporting those results back to a central server and where they're displayed on a web page. Now, this has been around in the industry for decades. They've always had these automated test facilities. But now here's an open source project which makes that possible within your research labs. So for me, when I was back in academia, what this meant is that if a graduate student wrote some code and I used CMake, every night CMake would automatically download and test that code to make sure it was still running. All right? So when that graduate student would leave the lab and graduate and go on to industry or academia, his code was still being recompiled every night. It would be tested every night to make sure it was still working. So if other people modified other parts of the code that he depended on and it broke his code, we'd know about it and we'd be able to fix it. So what this created was a continuum for the grad students within my lab, that they were constantly able to build upon one another's work as opposed to replicating their work. This was a huge benefit. This is normally something that only existed within industry, but now is readily available to everyone. Now, as I said, this came from the Insight Toolkit. Here, the National Library of Medicine donated or organized $13.5 million in order to come up with a way of segmenting and registering medical images. And it only contains algorithms. It's not a way of viewing these images or anything along those lines. They just wanted the algorithms to segment and register medical images. Now, the reason why they were interested in this is because it was the same group that came up with the visible man and the visible woman data. All right, so in the case of the visible man, he was incarcerated and put to death in Texas. He was an inmate in Texas. And he had donated his body to science, and so they actually froze his body and sent it out to Colorado. And there he was imaged using an MR scanner for his whole body at a very high resolution. They also then did high resolution CT on that body. So amount of radiation that a living person would not endure, they were able to give to this cadaver, this preserved cadaver. And then they did color cryosections where they thinly sliced the body and took images of all this. And the High Performance Center at the NLM paid for this. And this was this wonderful data resource that had been out there for a number of years prior to 1999. However, the difficulty was that every group, they would download this data, and then they would run their own software, come up with their own algorithms in order to process this. And so maybe one group at Washington University in St. Louis would come up with a great way of looking at the visible man's liver, and it would apply to other livers. Any MR scan of a liver, they could process it really well. And then maybe another group at Utah would come up with a great way of looking at kidneys. Well, back in 1999, if you wanted to look at both the liver and the kidneys together, use those two separate software platforms in order to look at the visible data, visible human data, or any clinical data, there was no chance. All right, back then, file formats were different. Even row versus column ordering on matrices was different because of the computer graphics influence on things. I mean, it was a very difficult time. Constant reinvention of the wheel was going on. NLM wanted to end that, and so they funded these groups in order to do that. One of the groups that was funded is my lab back at UNC, and that's how I got to know Kitware. I was back at UNC at the time. Well, fast forward now to 2013, and it really is the dominant medical imaging system that's out there. 1.5 million lines of code, estimated at 452 man-years of effort have gone into this toolkit in order to do its development, and it's extremely high quality. Via CMake, it is recompiled every night on 70 or more different machines, variety of different formats of machines, Mac, Linux, and so forth. And over 2,400 tests are run on each of those machines independently to verify that any change made that day on the toolkit hasn't broken the toolkit. It's only improved or enhanced its performance. And so this is a level of rigor that is astounding within an open source field. And really, I think that within the medical field, this is one of those watershed major change that occurs within the field that opens everyone's eyes to the possibilities of it. And so what happens now is if you look at ITK, here's a list of some of the applications that involve it, from radiology, simulation, microscopy, clinical trial software, on and on. This is a mix of both commercial and non-commercial applications. The thing is, this list, because of the BSD style license in ITK, we actually have no idea where all ITK is actually being used. So if you look at job postings from Philips, for example, or Siemens and GE, we've seen job postings that say ITK experience desired. All right? So we have an inkling that they're making use of ITK in some of their products. But because of the BSD license, we have no idea whether or not they're actually using it within their products. But ever so often, they'll contribute back a bug fix code from Philips or from Siemens or from GE or any of the other groups. And so they have really added quite a bit to the stability and comprehensiveness of this toolkit. So those are all great reasons to use open source. All right, it's a stable, reproducible platform. All right, made by the state-of-the-art people. All right, containing the best of the best. However, why should you contribute to open source? All right, why should you take that extra effort in order to do it? All right, well, it reminds me of a little story that that my old manager used to say. This was back when I was working at McDonnell Douglas, so even a number of years ago. So he always told the story of, an employee would walk into another boss's office, and the employee would say, "Hey, boss, I got a question for you." Boss would instantly respond, "Well, the answer is money. Now, what's the question?" All right? And so in reality, though, I think the way the field has evolved, the way that the influence of the Googles of the world and so forth has evolved, is that no longer is the answer always money. But I think the answer now, more than not, is impact. And so this is the modern day version of that. So open source is enabling a convergence of academia and industry, and that convergence is centered around impact. And that impact, the ability to open source, for open source to really go beyond anything that you as an individual are capable of, or you as the creator, initial creator of that open source is capable of. That is what should draw you to contributing to open source. Now, what I'm going to do is do a little bit of description of how academia and industry are coming together. So if you look at academia, you have academic research goal is impact, all right? You want to address important problems. You really want to save the world, change the world, all right? Key component, though, the harsh reality is that money is necessary in order to carry out your research. And so you as a professor also, this I had in spades in radiology department, was that I was keeping track of my own spreadsheets. I was sleepless nights in order to make sure I had funding for all the people within my lab if a grant didn't come through. I was dealing with spreadsheets. If people started not getting along with one another in my lab, I became an HR, human resource expert. I really had to do it all. I was running a business when it was that large, all right? There's no denying it. And also I had to publish. I had to advertise what I was capable of, and my ultimate goal was to make sales. It was to get grants, all right? And so, looking at this, what you all might think is that, well, generally agree with this, but then you can look and say, listen, publishing isn't advertising, all right? That's a little bit too negative of a view, all right? That really, I publish in order to get my ideas out there to better the world, all right? That's definitely true for a lot of you, but also the reality is that what you're trying to do is build a reputation via that advertisement, via your publications, all right? The reason why you're trying to build a reputation is that grant review process is not anonymous. All right, and so at least with the NIH, I know there's different agencies that do it differently, but grant review processes involves your reputation. Now, a lot of people think that this is evil and wrong, and here another story for you all. Lee Rosen, he's at the NIH. He runs one of the scientific review committees for the NIH, a good friend of mine. And he's like, well, the reason why that we don't have anonymous reviews, the reason why the review process knows who is submitting, the reviewers know who is submitting and applying for the grant funding, is because if you have someone, for whatever reason, in their grant proposal say that they want to go ahead and, as part of their research process, they're going to have to leap over this desk, all right? You might be, if you didn't know who that was, if you didn't know the person who had written that grant proposal and they said they're going to leap over that desk, you might picture, you know, the gray-haired professor down the hall trying to leap over his desk, and it might make you chuckle, but also it might make you suspicious of whether or not this person is going to be able to leap over their desk should you fund them to do something that you think they're going to fail at. However, if you know that that person is an Olympic jumper, an Olympic hurdler, and they've written up that they're going to jump over a desk as part of their research, you'd be like, yeah, I bet you they could. You know, they're an Olympic jumper. They've done it before. They're going to be able to do it again. And so that's his story of why the review process is not anonymous. And that's the story of why you actually do publish. And publishing is advertisement. And as part of your grant proposals, you cite all the publications that you have. And it's really why, in general, you're trying to build your reputation within the field. The reason why you should contribute to open source is because it helps you build your reputation in the field. It's another form of publication, and it's one that invites collaboration. It invites people to collaborate with you to do further grants, additional grants, even more directly than a publication does. Well, the same is true of industry as well. Our goal, no question, it's money, all right? So, you know, we can not apologize for it. We're in industry, it's what we do. However, to get that money, you have to solve important problems, all right? You don't want to solve an unimportant problem because no one will pay you money for it. You have to go after the important problems. You want to solve the hard ones, and that way you get more money. And a key aspect of that, or another way of phrasing that actually, is that you want to have impact. You want to solve that problem very well. Important problem, good solution. You're going to be a manager, you're going to advertise, you'll have sales and product development, all right? All of this, again, goes into building your reputation, though. You want to be known in the field. You know, it kind of, it's funny, I asked how many people knew that Kitware made CMake. It's not something that we do well. We don't like advertising ourselves well. We're trying to get better at it because we need to build our reputation up, because it is important to getting the grants and continuing on. So looking at this, all right, how is open source impacting an industry? Well, let's look at the example I'm most familiar with. How has open source impacted Kitware? Kitware has gone from this company which had failed products to actually now we've abandoned all notion of ever writing a product. All right, we've given up on selling things. Instead, we just sell ourselves. All right, and so the way we do this is by collaborating with other people on research projects, or else having them fund us in order to solve their hard problem using open source software. Ends up that this small company, main office is in New York. We have the office that I opened in North Carolina. We have collaborations, ongoing collaborations over the past, I went back around 5 years, 75 different academic institutes, 50 different government agencies have given us some level of funding. We have over 100 different commercial companies in which we've done collaborations, funded and grant-based collaborations. Personally, in my office now, we have 25 to 28 researchers. I'm PI on 5 NIH and actually a 6 DoD-funded grant. 2 of those are R01s. R01s are the base NIH basic research grants that are kind of the culmination of most academics' careers. And I've got 2 of those that I'm PI on. It's well over $7 million in funding that I've got from NIH and DoD. I'm chair of SPIE Medical Imaging CAD Conference this year and last year. And I'm chairing the Information Processing and Medical Imaging Conference in 2017. I got elected to the MICI Society Board of Directors just last year. That's from the MICI Society does a popular vote for that. I mean, my career has been launched really because of open source, and Kitware, the small company, is reaching and touching all of these different groups because of open source. So now let's look at some counter examples. Again, let's look at something more personal, and this is back in the academic field. You have a choice of going open source or not going open source, no question, all right? And I'll show you how there's a time and a place for both. But my experience is that back in 1996, I had two innovations. First method was a vessel extraction technique, all right? And this was really, at the time, a great method that had been developed over a number of years in cooperation with this amazing neurosurgeon, Elizabeth Bullitt. Multiple patents were filed by UNC on this topic, which really limited my ability to do publications, definitely blocked all ability to release it open source. However, very quickly, two different companies bought up these licenses and began to develop products for them, all right? And rapidly had prototypes of those products going. So it looked like this was a big winner. And at the same time, as kind of a sleeper project, I went ahead and had to, just out of necessity, because the standards weren't there at the time, there was no ITK, I had to make sure I could read and write a variety of different images in dealing with these different companies. And so I came up with this meta image format, all right, meta IO format that was out there, a file format that it was easy to read and write and convert other types of data into this format. It was extensible, and I just released it open source. Well, if you go ahead now and fast forward to 2013, the vessel extraction method, oh, and by the way, I just want to point out, I mean, the picture of me, that's with Elizabeth Bullitt on the right-hand side there. That's us at CNS, where one of the companies was actually demonstrating their projects to roomfuls of other neurosurgeons. So, I mean, this thing was really close to being a product. However, economic downturn, all these different factors led into the fact that both companies failed to actually release those products. So they never made it into market. All right? UNC ended up just last year abandoning that patent. And so if you look at the vessel extraction stuff, sure, I had a couple of publications out of it, wasn't able to do much in form of grants, wasn't able to give it to other people. It was really a dead end. But looking at from 2012 to 2013, I've actually now got 3 funded grants, a PI on one and co-PI or co-investigator on 2 of the other ones since 2012. It's actually now taking off now that UNC has abandoned those patents. While Meta.io, that's amazing. I actually Googled it in order to make this slide, and it's being used in toolkits I've never heard of. All right. Not only has someone ported it to image J that I had nothing to do with at all, it's been extended and supported by others as additional capabilities, and it continues to grow and be used. And so it really is a difference between these two, has led to vastly different experiences for me between these two. Now, one of the things, though, is I am not an open source zealot, despite having said it about 1 million times in the course of this presentation. Open source and closed source both have their place within any field. If you go ahead and look at open source, it is a conduit for academia and industry to really communicate. The more and more industry advertises ITK experiences desired, the more and more likely your graduate students are going to be able to leap into that job if you've been using ITK as well. Additionally, if you've come up with a really cool idea and you filed a patent on it and you implemented it using ITK, the researchers at the industrial group, or the developers at that industrial group, they're going to understand your code. They're going to be able to run your code right away because they know ITK as well. All right? It's this wonderful conduit that has occurred between the two. So it's brought academia and industry together in that way. Additionally, it reduces the development costs. You within your lab, you don't have to write yet another Gaussian filter. You just get the one from ITK. No recurring licensing fees, all right? So a lot of you all might use MATLAB. They have some very high costs associated with them if you're not in the academic field. And this provides a way of avoiding those costs. And then it also can coexist within products. So look at your double stuffed Oreo, open source, we're the double stuff, all right? And beneath that, though, you have your proprietary platforms, your hardware, your trackers, your MRI scanners, your CT machines, and on top of that is that thin layer, the other cookie, that is the proprietary applications which take that open source and adapt it into a surgical guidance toolkit, or adapt it into a surgical guidance application, or adapt it into a very strong radiological review workstation, that sort of thing. So these two can really exist together quite harmoniously. And I think we see that more and more between academia and industry coming together. And so one great example of that is one of my R01s is with Duke University, chief of neurosurgery there, Brigham and Women's Hospital, and myself. We are extending the Brain Lab system, which is a commercial surgical guidance system, in order to allow ultrasound that is acquired during a procedure to be registered with the preoperative MR. So They have methods for doing this already within the Brainlab system for registering these two based on markers on the skin, markers on the tools, establishing landmarks in the images, so forth and so on. But as you do a brain tumor resection, you know, in your MR, you see the tumor there, it's all done with the skull in place, so forth and so on. But as you begin to resect that tumor during the procedure, all of a sudden, you know, half the tumor's now missing. They've lost cerebral spinal fluid. We've had the effects of gravity, changes of pressure that have occurred. It's no longer possible to rigidly align those two data sets, the way the patient currently is as revealed by ultrasound, with the way the patient was when the MRI was taken a week ago. And so that deformable registration that has to occur between the two is something that we are investigating. Well, we're getting full access to the Brainlab system in order to do this. And that's because, you know, Brainlab, they're going to get a new use case. If this thing ends up working, they know that it's a viable research direction for them to pursue because the neurosurgeon's going to hopefully like it. It's something that we've developed using open source. It's something they can investigate further. Kitware is doing it because we're getting reputation in algorithms. It's hopefully going to attract some consulting business for us, maybe even back with Brainlab. And then Brigham and Women, that professor there, he's getting publications out of it. He's getting the funding for his graduate students. Also, he's getting access to this Brainlab data during procedures that he otherwise would not have ready access to. And so this open source, this open API, this collaborative spirit that was fostered by open source is all embodied within this one application. And so admittedly, open source, though, does have a cost associated with it, but I like to argue that even the cost has benefits. So that cost is your time and effort. One of the worst things that you can do is realize that there's an open source package out there already that does X, all right, that does Gaussian filtering. And yet you yourself, you look at that and it doesn't do Gaussian filtering exactly the way you do it. And so you invent a completely new package for Gaussian filtering, all right? Duplication of effort. You've only made some minor change, but instead of contributing, you went ahead and duplicated for the most part. You can look at the open source community as a limited resource. Anytime that you throw something else out there that duplicates something that's already out in the open source community, you've diluted that open source community resource. You've now made it where someone new to the field has to decide between the two packages, put their effort in one area versus the other area. It really is detrimental to the field, so avoid duplication. However, it does take effort to learn someone else's code. It does take discipline in order to take someone else's code and modify it to fit your needs exactly if necessary. And so, however, it's very important to do this. What essentially that is an instance of is participating in the existing community that's out there. And that participation takes time and effort. Additionally, when you write your own software, you want to just stick it on the web and forget about it. And next thing you know, people are emailing you questions. They're asking about documentation. They're letting you know that your software doesn't compile on some certain platform. It's a complete pain, all right? However, each of those people who have one of those questions, that's a potential collaborator who you might end up writing a grant proposal with. All right, that's someone who could make use of your toolkit in a new way. That's someone else who can go ahead and improve your reputation, cite your papers within their papers and publications. All right, and so you have to realize that this balance exists. So even this cost, this effort that you have to put into documentation and answering emails, the effort that you have to put into looking at what other code exists out there and not duplicating it, it all is participation in the community, and it's going to lead to your building your reputation. It has benefit. So final subject that I want to talk about is, all right, given that open source, we know now that open source is everywhere. It's good to use, and it's good to contribute to. So what effect is this going to have on the field of medical imaging? Well, what it's going to do in one of the areas that has interested me the most lately is this notion of pervasive computing. So if you look at platforms that are out there right now in which open source can be run, we got the Google Glasses and some other options that are coming out. They're going to have open APIs or a variety of APIs for accessing. We've got Watch. I've got one of these Pebble watches. All right, wrote my own clock face to it, everything along those lines. So you got watches that you can go ahead and modify via open source. You have the Fitbit, which goes ahead and tracks your movement, and they have ones of those now that are getting open APIs, Nike Watch and so forth. You've got your phone, you got your tablet, you got your desktop, server, and cloud. These are all platforms on which you can write software now. So open source software in your development is no longer just for your desktop machine. It's no longer for your laptop. It's no longer something that you have to go to, but it's something that's going to be on you, around you, constantly. All right? So this, as open source development goes, it's going to invite that many more developers. It's going to invite that many more kind of MakerBot, kind of grassroots efforts in order to take advantage of these new platforms. This explosion that we saw in open source in that graph that was given showed a doubling of open source projects by 2014. I expect it's going to actually be higher than that. I think that the number of platforms that we have is just going to have this amazing effect on open source in our lives. And in medical, this is really going to be interesting to see how this evolves. All right, so in the medical field, the standard of care right now is you walk into a doctor's office and the doctor or the physician's assistant or the nurse or whoever is like, all right, so what's the problem? What's been ailing you? How long has it been ailing you? What other ways has it been affecting your life? They have a whole bunch of questions in which they, at that moment that you walk in the office, they're trying to recreate this past history that has involved whatever is causing you to go into their office, all right? They're trying to recreate and get an idea of what's been going on in your life when you walk in that office door. Well, with pervasive computing and this pervasive monitoring, that's going to undergo massive changes within the next couple of years. I mean, it's great. I mean, I got a friend who not only posts his Fitbit and all of his runs to Facebook, but he has a scale. And the scale monitors his weight, all right? And it posts that to Facebook. I would never go there, all right? But he's a younger guy. He's about 20 years younger than me now that I think about it. Anyway, and so there's this whole attitude and there's this whole pervasiveness of computing now that for a medical practitioner, this is a gold mine. You no longer have someone say, well, I think I've been losing weight. But you can go online to this guy's Facebook page and look at the history of weight changes they've gone to. Or you look at his Runkeeper logs and say, oh, look at this, your time for your mile has steadily decreased over the last 3 months. Or you go to his Facebook page and says, well, last night you went out and had this gigantic burrito. Maybe that's why you're not feeling so good today. You know, it's going to really change in the way medical care is provided. And another exciting way is that it's going to move medical care not only when you're in the doctor's office and he's accessing all these records, but out in the field. If you go OnStar systems right now, if you're in an accident, not only do they automatically call the OnStar people and get emergency crews out there, but they'll inform OnStar of your speed of travel, the severity of the impact, whether it was a front or rear end or side collision. It gives OnStar and the emergency crew, before they even get to your site, a notion of what kind of injuries to expect at that spot. Additionally, if you go ahead and you have someone an elderly person in their home, we're looking at robotic system offering care that way. But also we see now that what I show there is an iPhone and there's Androids and so forth that can be hooked up to an ultrasound probe. So that people who go ahead and have, there's a variety of cases. So you can have a situation where as you grow older, you lose the ability to tell if your bladder is full. All right, and so they're developing ultrasound systems which allow people to monitor how full their bladder is so that they know when to relieve it automatically, all right? And they do this with these ultrasound systems. So the ultrasound system no longer is not going to require them to decide, to analyze that ultrasound image and decide, oh, that's my bladder right there, and oh, it's looking kind of full. It's a system that you place down, and via software, it says bladder full, bladder not full. It does the whole analysis for you. It makes this ultrasound system non-ionizing radiation, very little risk to it, but in vivo imaging of yourself possible in your home environment. So if you, the number of applications I think of this is going to be phenomenal. So with pervasive computing going on, what this is also going to lead to is open science. And open source is just one step in the open science formula. So the formula is open source plus open data plus documentation, SPIE journals, open access, and so forth. That leads to open science. And that, again, just as open source, we see a return to open source where software originally was open source, then it went closed, now it's back to open. Science is the same way. If you look at the original publications that were out there in the scientific field, what was honored was not only the original inventor of the idea, but also the first people who were able to replicate that person's idea, replicate that experience. That was inherent in the original techniques of scientific method. If you look at a lot of journal publication nowadays, first thing you have to do is sign a form assuring that it's never been published anywhere else and that it's all unique and novel work. We're going to see that going away more and more as this open science, this notion of replication becomes dominant. So the idea put forth originally was doubt everything. Only believe in those things that are evidently true, that are reproducible. Now, this might sound like a good philosophy and a wonderful trend. The thing is, this is going to have major impact. Article that was published in Nature in 2012 has received a fair amount of traction on the internet. So here are two gentlemen, one from the pharmaceutical industry, another one an academic researcher. This gentleman in the pharmaceutical industry, he headed the research lab at this group, and over a series of, I believe it was 10 years, he had identified 53 landmark publications in cancer research. And he wanted to know whether or not his pharmaceutical company should go ahead and pursue those directions that were put forth in those 53 landmark papers. All right, so over the course of the 10-year, it was 53 papers. So they went ahead, contacted authors of these papers, did their best, read the journal articles, made every effort in order to replicate the results that were presented in these 53 landmark papers to decide, as an industry, should we head in this direction? Well, it ends up that in 47 of the 53 papers, he was completely unable to replicate the results. All right. So as science goes, as this notion that what we have via a publication is really advancing and enabling the field, if you're a professional person extremely motivated to replicate your results and often with your help is unable to replicate those results, that's a serious concern. Open source, open science addresses these issues. So last slide, it is not without risk though. All right, so open source, wonderful potential, completely untried in the courts of law. So things that can bring down open source, Slicer right now is under a threat of litigation from a patent troll who happened to have bought a patent involved in MRI data processing. He's going after Brigham and Women's Hospital for releasing this open source software, all right, that enables other people to infringe on his patent, all right? And you know, it's not going to go to a court of law. They're going to settle out of court. And he has a long history of doing these kinds of things. These sorts of things are actually very detrimental to the field. It's a risk that is hard to mitigate. Additionally, there's this notion that when you contribute some software to an open source group, you might not have the concept of how valuable that software is at the time you contribute it. So there's notion that when you enter into a contract, you have to be fully cognizant about the extent of the contract that you're entering into. If that software ends up having some major impact in the future, it's unproven at this point, it's untried in law, but you might be able to say that, oh, you know what, it's no longer open source. I changed my mind. All right, now it's closed source, now you have to pay me some money. Completely untried in the court of law, could go either way. Chances are it's going to be okay, but we'll have to see how that evolves. And additionally, what we've seen is YouTube and and Google and different places like that getting sued for hosting content uploaded by users that infringed on other people's copyright. Imagine GitHub getting sued because some software that they hosted on a GitHub account infringed on someone else's patent. Totally feasible, all right? Lawyers will sue anything. I can say this, my father, both my sisters are lawyers. I can keep saying negatives. But anyway, it's going to be interesting to see how this evolves in a court of law. And so is GitHub responsible when some software they host infringes on a patent? Or if you're a grad student and you infringe on a patent after you've uploaded some software, or even worse, image-guided surgical toolkit, this free thing that's now in a commercial product, somehow harm happens to someone during the surgery doesn't go well. Who ends up getting sued? Is it GitHub that gets sued? Is it Kevin Cleary, the original inventor of IGSTK? Or is it the company that sold it? Chances are it's going to be some number of all of the above. So we'll have to see how it goes. So even despite these fears, though, what I want you to walk away with is that open source is here to stay. It's leading to open science. It is dominating our field. It's in every aspect of computing all throughout our body and around us. And we are the double-stuffed Oreo. We coexist with commercial that allows academia and industry to come together. And so not only should you make use of it, but really I strongly encourage you all to contribute back to it. Thank you.